Well, Trump's law and order message is predominantly designed to court white voters in suburban areas, particularly in swing states. That's a demographic that Trump thinks he can win and that he has to win if he's going to get reelected. The tactic is largely fear-based in that it leverages much of the imagery that's been amplified on social media and elsewhere about the looting, rioting, and general unrest. So Trump's goal there is to depict himself as really the only guarantor of safety in these communities. However, I do think that one challenge is that if you look at some of the polls, for example, from Gallup, only 4% of Americans think that crime and violence are the country's most important problem. Unsurprisingly, that's dwarfed by issues like the coronavirus and poor leadership and the economy in general. So its salience may not be as high as Trump perceives. As an incumbent, I also think it's hard for Trump to champion law and order because these events really are happening under his watch. Therefore, it makes it a little bit harder for him to make the case that he's the unique antidote to the problem. If you look at the polls also in recent days, they've generally remained fairly flat, suggesting maybe that Trump's not making the kind of inroads that he wants to.
Yeah, that's interesting. So the economy is gaining traction as an issue, you would say, at this point. I mean, clearly the economy and COVID do seem to be intermingled at this point, and the data does appear to be getting a little bit better, particularly around the manufacturing side, and the market indices have been rising. Is all of this perhaps feeding into the idea expressed by some people like Nate Silver that Trump's got a real shot?
Well, certainly it's the case that this race isn't over. But if Trump wants to win, I do think that he has to flip the script on the idea that 2020 needs to be a referendum on his time in the Oval Office. Right now, Trump's disapproval numbers are roughly 10 percentage points higher than his approvals. And the challenges, as you note, of the coronavirus and a flagging economy have made it much harder for him to ask voters the question, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? So Trump really needs to find an in against Biden. And I think his strategy was largely reflected in the Republican National Convention, and that was to paint Biden as, a member of the so-called radical left, someone who's anti-business, someone who's intent on subverting traditional family values. But still, it really is important to keep in mind that, a 7 percentage point lead, roughly, which is what Biden holds right now, can disappear in a hurry. And it's also, of course, not the national polls that matters. It's kind of individual state by state and who ultimately wins these battlegrounds.
And Thomas, as I talk with wealth managers, many of them are trying to price into the fourth quarter playbook the idea of, they see it as a nightmare scenario, that ultimately the result is too close to call and that President Trump contests the result and refuses to leave the presidency. What odds would you give that outcome?
Well, if this race does stay close, it's certainly not an impossibility. I do think that the odds of that not happening are greater than that happening, but it's certainly not something that you can rule out. I think we're probably having flashbacks right now to 2000, where this race was kind of too close to call, and it ended up extending several days after the election before we knew who the ultimate victor was. Of course, the worst thing for markets is instability, unpredictability, not knowing what's happening tomorrow. And so, that is something, of course, that businesses are going to think is, a possibility and something probably that they're quite concerned about.